Like many of the Bible passages we've been reading this year, our reading for today from Matthew 25 is a parable. A parable is simply a short story that is used to illustrate a spiritual truth. A parable is something that Jesus used again and again over the course of his ministry. You see, the disciples of Jesus had asked him a question. They wanted to know the time of the second coming. The second coming being the time that Jesus would return to the earth. It's the time that would mark the end of this age, or perhaps better known as Judgment Day, as it were. The disciples wanted to know when this was all planned to take place. What sort of things did they need to look out for to know that it was coming? Could they have a clue so they knew when it was going to happen? Or better still, could Jesus just give them a date and a time so they can put it in the calendar? Unsurprisingly, Jesus told them a parable. So if we were part of that audience of disciples 2,000 years ago, we would have understood this parable because we would have understood the customs used in the illustration. There was a Jewish custom where the bridegroom and his attendants would come to the home of the bride's parents, then take the bride along with her attendants in a bridal procession back to his parents' house, where the wedding celebration would happen. The use of lamps identified someone as belonging to the wedding procession. So much so that if you didn't have a lamp, you didn't get to go into this wedding celebration. For many of us today, these are not customs we are familiar with. And for others of us, we may actually belong to faiths or faith traditions where these customs still take place. Regardless, when we read the parable of the 10 virgins today, 2,000 years or so after it was first told to that audience of disciples, we'd understand the principle Jesus was trying to illustrate. The parable makes things very clear. When it is time for Jesus to come into his kingdom, it shows who is included in the kingdom and who is left on the outside, who is in and who is out. In many Bible commentaries, mention is made about the wise virgins being those who are true Christians, and the foolish ones being those who hang out with the Christian crowd, but when it comes down to it, they don't have a relationship with Jesus. We have other parables that we've been given too throughout the Bible, where distinctions are made between people, sheep and goats anyone, wheat and chaff. Perhaps it will come as a welcome relief today to you that I'm not inclined to preach on end-time theology. Suffice to say that in the Uniting Church, a fundamental belief is that Jesus will come again to the earth. It will mark the end of times and we'll see God's people united with him. No, today I feel like we should talk about something else. So many of you would know that for some good many years of my life, I was part of the Pentecostal church. And there are many things that Pentecostals are known for. Speaking in tongues for one. Knowing how to take up a good tithe and offering is another. They are known for walking in the Spirit and for words of knowledge and for taking up even more tithes and offerings. Yes, they are known for all these things, to which I'll add one more, are focused on getting people saved. Being saved is a term used about people finding salvation. That in and of ourselves, we are separated by God from sin. We need the salvation offered by Jesus to restore that connection back to God. Either people are saved or they aren't. I'm not sure if it was because I was a Pentecostal or at the time was relatively young, or it is because I was both, a young Pentecostal. But I remember being caught up in this fixation over who was saved and who wasn't saved. You can imagine passages like Matthew 25 feed right into this outlook of the world. There were many conversations we'd have about family and friends and whether that person was saved, and if not, how are we going to get them saved? And strangely, I recall conversations, about other sort of faith backgrounds. If my memory serves me right, those of you from Catholic backgrounds didn't make the cut. Sorry, but you were not considered to be saved. Other conversations I recall suggested the Queen Mother was a Christian and was also saved. I'm not actually sure about the rest of the royal family, though. They didn't get a mention. I just heard about the Queen Mother. So again, saved. But you can get the picture. It's very much about who is saved and who is not. Thankfully, those days are behind me. And I hope at least I see the world in a somewhat different way. But the one thing I do remember from those days was being somewhat troubled by this parable of the 10 virgins. Here we had 10 virgins that went out to meet the bridegroom. All of them fell asleep. There were 5 that were deemed to be wise because they took along some oil. And there were 5 that were deemed to be foolish who did not take along any oil. When the bridegroom finally came, what I do remember is that there was no sharing of the oil between those who had some and those who didn't. And when it came to time to go off with the bridegroom, there seemed to be no concern for the 5 virgins left behind. Everyone just went off. No one looked back. No one seemed to care much about the fact that people were going to be left behind. It was really like, we are out of here, bitches, and off everyone went. What troubled me about this parable is that, to me, it feels like a very individualistic approach to Christianity. It seems to encourage us to be the super Christian, off doing the good Christian things. And as long as my relationship with God is great and my relationship with the church is okay, that's really all that matters. It encourages us to forget that we are part of a much larger tapestry of faith, where it's not just about me, but it's about us. That maybe, just maybe, I need you, and you will need me if we're going to get through this thing called life. It's easy to see that if focus was on this parable alone, we can easily go down the path of who is saved and who is not. Could I even suggest that most of us as Christians and most of our churches, if not all, have this theme playing out in some sort of fashion? It's a Christianity that would see us identifying with the 5 virgins who are wise, rather than the 5 who are foolish. Because deep down, we all like to think that we've made it. And let's be honest, no one likes to be foolish. And it is here that I have a confession to make. There are many times in life that I feel like I'm surely more like one of the foolish versions than the wise. There are many times in life where things have been difficult, times where I really didn't care much for God, times where I didn't want to be at church. At those times, were Jesus to have returned, I suspect I could not have been asked to wake up and get out of bed, let alone go find my stash of oil, trim my lamp and go out and meet him. So that's a bit of my confession. Now, I'm sure today, as we look around, this is not a congregation that would ever be like that. Or perhaps more of us are like that than we'd care to admit. But I, for one, am going to say that at times I felt like that, and probably still will feel that way many times in the future. As all good Christians, we are encouraged to identify with the ones that get out there and change the world for Jesus. The ones who are all fired up for God and ready to take ground for the kingdom. We're not good at talking about the days when we really don't like God much, or we don't want to be at church or even say we are Christian. And yet I wonder if we are both. Sometimes we are like the 5 wise virgins, all ready and raring for Jesus to return, and sometimes we are like the 5 foolish virgins, who don't seem to have enough oil. Are we all set then to spend the rest of our days going from one of these extremes to another, from being fired up to not being on fire at all? The 5 wise virgins didn't seem keen on helping the 5 foolish ones out, and that troubled me. The best they could do was offer advice. You need to go down to the shops and buy some oil. Yet if I was to read the Bible beyond this parable, I'd find plenty of verses that would be very inconsistent with the way these wise virgins acted. In the book of Ruth, we meet Ruth, a widow who is instructed by her mother-in-law Naomi to go glean in the fields. She ends up in a field belonging to Boaz. Eventually they meet, get it happening together, and both of them can be found as part of the genealogy of Jesus. Some of you have probably heard of gleaning. Maybe some of you haven't. So gleaning is a law. It was written into Jewish law that when you harvest your fields, you do not reap to the very edges of your field. The grain on the edges of the field was left for the poor. There was always something left for someone else. If Boaz was like a wise virgin, I suspect Ruth would have got nothing. Or at best, he would have told her to go down to the shops and buy some grain for herself. And of course, it would be very easy to assume that we can limit this sort of thing to the physical things that we share, like food and money. And sometimes that's much easier to give us something that doesn't require our time. But I'd ask, what about our time? How busy do we get with our time that we don't have room to give anyone else a part of it? We read in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 to 10, that two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friends can help him up. Yet nowhere in the parable of the 10 virgins is there ever an indication that anyone would help someone else. Perhaps that's what's left out of this parable. It makes us think we are self-made, that we don't need anyone else. Because behold, if we did, we'd be like the foolish virgins, and we know what happened to them. It is telling when asked about the time of the second coming that not once does Jesus give the time or the dates. In fact, the disciples are told there is only one who knows when the second coming is to take place, and that is God. And God is very happy keeping that information to themselves. I'm sure it would be so much easier if we knew. We could all be out there ready and waiting with our lamps shining brightly, full of oil, and our wicks all nicely trimmed. Or do you think that it could be that if we knew the date and the time, our whole approach to the second coming would change? That in our humanity, we might treat it more as an event. Just say like a uni exam that you cram for the night before rather than taking time to study across a whole semester. Is it possible then, by not knowing the date or the time, that we end up living a life that is pleasing to God? Because then we would have to get out there and try. We'll have our good and bad days in the process, but at least we'll be out there and living life, not waiting around for some event to occur. And that's just it, isn't it? We like our Christianity in absolutes. We like it clean. We don't like it getting messy. We prefer to send someone down to the shops to buy some oil rather than have some set aside that they could glean. We'd prefer to be a wise virgin, the perfect Christian, ready and waiting for Jesus rather than a foolish one, because that would show weakness. I think we are at our most real when we admit to being both. We are both wise and foolish, both in need of help and the help giver, ready for Jesus to return and at times not caring less. More importantly, in all of this, we need each other. For when one of us falls down, someone is ready to help us up. Perhaps then, there would be neither a wise or foolish virgin waiting for Jesus to return, but instead a group of people that helped each other out along the way.